Well, today we're going to discuss populations. And you can see a population of fish right on this title slide. Also, down in the left-hand corner, we have some age structure pyramids and diagrams, which really we use more with human populations. And we'll get into that maybe not today, but we'll get into that on the next slideshow. And here we're going to be discussing more about what we call exponential growth and logistic growth. So the objectives today. Learners will be able to evaluate population growth. So you're going to be able to understand and evaluate population growth, especially in regards to logistic and exponential growth. And we're going to have some follow-ups on this, including some math. And all of that will go towards our assessment of your progress. But what else? The other things I want to point out on these slides, as we've been doing all year, the left-hand column. So what is a population and how can it change over time? I do want you to think about that. We've covered what populations were earlier in the year. Also, if we take a look, it does say dynamic versus static. Dynamic means it changes. Static, it stays the same. Do populations change? Or are they constant at all times? Well, you have a triangle exercise, again, as we've been doing all year, which you're going to complete on this in this Ed puzzle format. That's the only difference. So I'm going to ask you to connect the three terms. Again, connect one term to another term in a sentence, and do that for all three terms. So it should be 3 total sentences. And we've done this again all year. So it should be understood. And if you do have any questions, you can always contact me anyway. So our three terms are population, adaptation, and genes. And these are all terms we've discussed before. So it does say logistic growth, J-curve, and exponential growth on the side, and we will get more into that as we go along. To be aware of those terms on the side. They do change, and I'll highlight that for you. So populations, as hopefully you remember, and hopefully you've already written, a population is a group of organisms from the same species that interact on a daily basis. They interact frequently. Below you see a picture. I want you to tell me whether or not you think this is a population or part of a population. Obviously, it's only 4 birds, but do you think this is part of a population? Explain why or why not. What does this word disperse mean? Just think about it in terms of English, right? So disperse means to spread out. Populations have characteristics, just like anything else. So what are the characteristics, the major characteristics of populations? I'm going to go through them real quickly. Obviously, size is one. And this is just the number of organisms in that population. Remember, they're all the same species. So you have small populations, you have large populations, and that does have influences on the populations themselves and also on the environment. And there's many things we can get into just with size. What is density? And of course, that pause was for you to answer the question. The density is the number of something, in this case we're dealing with individuals, per unit area. So it's not just how big the population is, but how spread out is it? And how is it spread out? That gets back to the idea of dispersion. So if you take a look at the diagrams on the bottom, we have a uniform dispersion, where everything is equally spread out. Random dispersion, where it's actually there's mathematical, we use the word random all the time, but there's a mathematical definition of that. you can use statistics, which I have. It's so much fun. And what you can do is you can find out a dispersal, if a dispersion, let's call it that, is random, or it just looks like it's scattered about. Again, there's real definition for that. Or is it clustered or clumped? Think about this from an ecological standpoint. Why might you think that a uniform dispersion would exist in nature, or a clumped dispersion would exist in nature, or even a random dispersion would exist in nature? What do these dispersion patterns say to us? Well, I'll give you some realistic examples. So a clump dispersion pattern is something you might find with squirrels around large oak trees in a forest. Makes sense. There's resources there. There's a positive association, meaning they cluster together. Whereas a uniform dispersion tells us that there's a negative association between those organisms. So instead of a positive association like a herd of deer or a bunch of squirrels around an oak tree, and that's dictated by resources, right? Uniform might be territoriality. So you might have seabirds on a beach with nests, and they want to be a certain distance away. I think social distancing, but that's not how it really works. They want to be a certain amount. I guess it does meet that definition in a way, but a certain amount of distance between those nets. They defend those territories. You can think about circles around those dots, and then you would see, wait a minute, there's a certain amount of space around each that they're defending. So territories would show a uniform dispersion and that kind of a distribution, right? And social just means you're in a society, so you're dealing with other organisms, right? In this case, the same species for sure. Random means there really is no positive or negative correlation here. There's no association. They are just there. So there's not a negative force pushing them apart. There's not a positive force driving them together. Age distribution. You saw that in the pyramids in the first title slide, that you could have more individuals that are young. And then think about what would happen over time if more of the population was young versus old. Or conversely, more of the population was old versus young. And we do not only have to think about humans in this regard at all. We can apply population dynamics, how populations change, to nature overall, to different populations of organisms, not just to humans, but it does apply to us. And we are part of nature. Let's not forget that. See the elephants and the rabbits. We'll talk about why that's there in a second. But now we're talking about population change. In population change, remember, populations are not static. They are dynamic. They can be stable, where the numbers really fluctuate minimally, but they're still dynamic. So how do populations change? How can that be measured? Think about it this way. Birth rate, you're adding individuals. They're being born. Immigration rate, they're coming into a population. They're adding to it again. Subtract from that how many individuals die, the death rate. And rate really applies to over a certain amount of time. And usually we do years. There's protocol for this if we're measuring human populations especially, but there's protocol with animal populations too. Also, we're subtracting, even though there's a plus sign. Emigration, remember, E is for exit and I is for immigration. I've covered that on the video as well. But I is for immigrating, coming into a population, where E is exiting a population. So that gets a negative sign in front of it. You're subtracting it away. Those are individuals leaving. So again, the parentheses, remember math class, that means that death is being subtracted, but emigration is also being subtracted. It's within the parentheses. Every species has its own what we call biotic potential. By the nature of being an elephant, it can reproduce at a different rate than rabbits. So why is that? I'll let you tell me. Think about it. As I scroll through this slide quickly, potential. What's potential means? It means that it can happen, right? Doesn't mean it always has to happen. It has the potential to. If we talk back about the elephants and rabbits, realize the gestation period for an elephant is 2 years. So it can't have as many kids as a rabbit because it has a much shorter period where it's pregnant and it has more kids at once. A rabbit has more kids at once than an elephant does. Again, that goes back to the idea of the biotic potential. Also, thinking about population change, the environment's a big part of that. So, environmental resistance would be all the factors that limit the growth of a population in a place at a time. So, this fights against the biotic potential, it's the opposing force. So, together with how they could reproduce as a species, as a population, and the environmental resistance, what limits that reproduction. We have what we call carrying capacity. And I've used this example before. We talked about carrying capacity before. Carrying capacity, again, is like that guy with the groceries below. He has a certain amount of groceries that he can hold. And if he can't hold any more and you put more on it, some will fall, if not all of them. We'll get back to that. The capacity is how much. And a carrying capacity is how many individuals that a population can hold. How many individuals that the environment can hold from a population. Let me review that. So the environment can carry a certain number of individuals in a population. Why? What is it about the environment that has limits? What determines carrying capacity? I'm going to show you, and there are many resources. Resources determine carrying capacity. There are other limits to population growth, and we're going to go through them. But some resources include food and water, and places to hide, and homes for nesting birds. There would be places to put their nest. Sometimes it has to be inside a cavity of a tree, and there might not be enough of them. So if resources are unlimited, including space, populations exhibit exponential growth, which is what you see below. That was a J curve. Looks like a J. Do you think exponential growth can go on forever where it just starts out slow like that? And it picks up and keeps increasing. Go back to that last slide. Is there a carrying capacity? I'm going to explain your reasoning for your answer. Here's another example that is not exponential growth. And you can compare the two on this slide here. That would be exponential growth. They start the same, but logistic growth reaches a carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity here is how many individuals? Again, I'll let you tell me. So once you arrive at the carrying capacity, I want you to look at this slide, or this the same slide, this image on this slide. And if you really take a look at it, yeah, they start the same. There's an exponential growth phase, and then they start to slow down. So the number of individuals keeps increasing until we reach up around that carrying capacity. Realize no one told Mr. Fish here, you got to stop having kids, and we're going to really level this off. And it doesn't work that way, even if the fish did understand that, or you told the fish that, or no. There's a stable equilibrium phase that does go up and down a bit. It fluctuates about and around that carrying capacity. That is still logistic growth. If you take a look, J curve looks like a J. Logistic growth looks like an S, kind of. Yeah, but we call it an S curve, so good enough. We have different controls that limit population growth. We have density independent and density dependent. Remember what density means? It's the number of organisms in a certain area. If they're packed in together, there's a higher density. So, using that definition, I want you to think for a second. Is a disease density dependent or density independent population control? Obviously, a disease, if it's virulent enough, if it's strong enough, it can be lethal and it can kill and add to the death rate in the population. Does that depend upon the density of the population or not? Well, hopefully you've answered that by now. And you had to, because that's how Edpuzzle works. And realize that, yes, disease is density dependent. That's one reason with the pandemic that social distancing can work. We spread out. We get away from other individuals and the disease cannot spread. More packed, densely populated areas when there is a disease are more prone to that disease and it gets spread more in that area. Density independent, I'll give you one example and I'll have you go through some more, would be a fire that burns down a forest. Doesn't matter how many frogs there were or toads on the ground. If they burn, they all burn together. It's not because there are more of them that the fire has a different effect. So that's a density independent population control, and it does limit population. We've gone through logistic growth, we've gone through exponential growth, but nature is not that simple. So we do have predator-prey models and other types of population curves, and if you look at the hare and the lynx data here, the hare is in blue and the lynx is in red. It appears that as the hare population goes up, those are bunny rabbits, and the lynx are the predators that eat them. They're big cats. So they're like bobcats. And as these go up, behind them, the lynx go up because they have more to eat. So in this case, the prey, the number of prey, influence the number of predators. This is actually what we call bottom-up control, at least it seems to be from this graph. It may well be more complicated than that. Oftentimes it is. Sometimes the number of predators really determine more so the number of prey items. So the predators control the prey populations. That's top-down control. Either way, this does show or appear to show a link between the hare and lynx populations. It often is much more complicated than that. And speaking of complexity, we can have cyclic, and this is cyclic too. It goes up and down, boom and bust, but there could be other reasons for cyclic populations. You could have eruptive, which all of a sudden, whoop, you get a big blip over here, which means there's a huge spike in population, but most of the time it's kind of stable. Here it's pretty stable. And here it's irregular, it's kind of all over the place. But all of these things can change. Carrying capacities can change. None of this is necessarily going to be stable for a long time. You have to look at time scale. You have to look at a lot of different factors and see what actually is going to occur, what is happening now, and what could be happening in the future. We'll get into some more math and have you do some graphing in the next lesson.